They expelled the bastard from the mansion. Now she's back as the heiress who will destroy them all. The silence in the room was so thick, it seemed to drain the air from their lungs. 8 people sat around the mahogany table, each dressed in black, each with their eyes fixed on the sealed envelope in the lawyer's hands. The Dawson mansion had never felt so cold, even under the golden glow of the crystal chandeliers. Margaret Dawson, the widow, sat at the head of the table, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her were her children, Liam, in a flawless suit and with a calculating gaze, and Victoria, with blood-red lipstick and an expression of aristocratic boredom. Lawyers, accountants, witnesses, everyone waited. The envelope was opened. The paper crackled, and then the lawyer spoke the name that froze time. Claire Dawson. Margaret turned pale. Liam shot up from his chair so violently that it toppled backward. Victoria dropped her wineglass, which shattered against the marble floor. Chaos erupted, because that name wasn't supposed to be there. That name had been erased, expelled, buried with the family's shame. They had thrown her out of the mansion, but forgot that her blood also ran through that empire. Claire Dawson grew up like a ghost inside her own house. While the others dined in the grand hall, she ate in the kitchen with the maids. While Victoria received haute couture dresses, Claire wore the old uniforms Margaret deemed more appropriate for her condition. While Liam was being trained to inherit the family empire, Claire was trained to disappear. She had no photos on the walls, no seat at the table, no name engraved on the family's antique jewelry. She was only the bastard daughter, the mistake Edward Dawson had made with a woman no one ever mentioned. But Claire had her father's eyes, the same light green that shimmered in the sun, the same distant look when staring out the window. Edward knew. He had always known, but he never said a word, never defended her, never held her, and then he died. On the day of the funeral, Margaret handed Claire a small suitcase and said only, "You have until dawn to leave." No hug, no words of comfort, only a command, cold as the marble of the freshly sealed tomb. She only wanted to belong, but fate would teach her to rule. The rain hammered against the windows of the Dawson mansion, as if the sky itself were furious. Inside, the grand hall glimmered beneath the silver chandeliers, filled with the familiar faces of the city's elite. It was the family's annual dinner, a tradition Edward had kept for decades, a display of power, wealth, and lineage. Claire was in the kitchen, as always. She adjusted her white apron and held the silver tray with both hands. On it, French champagne glasses fizzed softly. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, a mix of silent humiliation and restrained rage that had lived inside her for years. "Hurry up, bastard," growled one of the older maids, giving her a slight shove with her elbow. "Mrs. Margaret doesn't like to wait." Claire didn't answer. She simply pushed open the double doors and stepped into the hall. The contrast was brutal. From the warm, humid kitchen to that ocean of luxury, silk dresses, tailored suits, fake laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses, the scent of expensive perfume mingled with red wine in the air. And there, at the center of it all, sat Margaret Dawson, like a queen on an invisible throne. She wore a black lace dress, pearls around her neck and wrists, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a flawless chignon. Her ice-blue eyes followed Claire the moment she entered. Her thin, cruel smile curved her crimson lips. "Ah, Claire," Margaret said, raising her voice just enough for everyone to hear. "How punctual you are. Bring the champagne, dear. Our guests are waiting." Claire walked silently between the tables. She could feel their stares, hear their whispers. She knew what they said about her. She always knew. "Is that the bastard? They say the mother was a secretary. Edward must have been drunk." She poured each glass with mechanical precision. Didn't look anyone in the eyes, didn't smile. Just did her job and tried to disappear like she always did. But Margaret wasn't going to let her leave so easily. "Claire, wait," she called, tapping her knife against the glass to draw attention. The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to Margaret. "I'd like to make a toast." Claire froze halfway across the room, her back to the main table. "A toast," repeated Margaret, rising slowly with the poise of someone who knows she's about to destroy another human being. "To the Dawson family, to the pure lineage my late husband built with such pride, and to clarity. Because, my dear friends, there's something I must clarify tonight." Claire's heart began to pound faster. "Claire," Margaret continued, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Turn around, dear. Let everyone see you." Claire turned slowly. Her eyes met Margaret's, and in them there was only sadistic delight. You all know the story, Margaret said, pacing around the table like a predator circling its prey. But I've never spoken it aloud. Edward had a lapse in judgment with a woman who worked for him, a secretary in fact. And from that unfortunate relationship came Claire, murmurs began. Claire felt her face burn. But Edward, being the generous man he was, Margaret continued with fake compassion, decided to bring this child into our home, to raise her, to feed her, to give her a roof, and we, as a family, accepted that burden, because that's Christian charity, isn't it? Victoria chuckled under her breath. Liam watched with crossed arms, a smug smile on his face. But now, Margaret stopped right in front of Claire, close enough for her suffocating perfume to sting. Now that Edward is gone, there's no reason to keep up this charade. Absolute silence. You don't belong to this family, Claire, Margaret said, her voice cold as ice. You never did. You are the mistake of a dead man, and I will no longer allow you to stain the Dawson name with your presence. Claire couldn't breathe. Tears burned in her eyes, but she held them back with everything she had. Pack your things, Margaret ordered, and leave. Now. Margaret, Claire began, but her voice broke. Now! Margaret shouted, and the entire hall trembled. Liam stood and strode toward Claire, gripping her arm with unnecessary force. You heard my mother, let's go. He dragged her through the hall, and Claire didn't resist. She had no strength left. She heard the laughter, the whispers, the contemptuous stares. Victoria raised her glass and made a mocking toast. To purity. Liam shoved her outside. The rain hit her instantly, cold and violent. He threw an old suitcase at her feet. Don't come back, he sneered. You're nothing. You never were. Then the door slammed shut. Claire stood there under the rain, staring at the glowing mansion. She could still hear the music, the laughter, life continuing as if she had never existed. The tears finally fell, mixing with the rain. She clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms. Something broke inside her that night. Something soft, gentle, human, and something new was born. Something cold, calculated, merciless. That night, a bastard died, and an heiress began to rise. 3 months later, Claire received a letter. She was living in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town, working as a waitress in a small, filthy cafe. The envelope arrived bearing the seal of the law firm Harrison and Styles, the same firm that handled the Dawson family's affairs. Claire opened it with trembling hands. Dear Miss Dawson, we inform you that the official reading of the will of Edward Jonathan Dawson will take place next Saturday at 2 p.m. at the family mansion. Your presence has been requested by the deceased. Sincerely, Arnold Harrison. She read it 3 times, trying to understand. Why would her father include her in the will? He had never spoken to her about inheritances. In truth, he had hardly ever spoken to her about anything. But there was something in that letter, a tiny, fragile, almost pathetic hope, that made her decide to go. On Saturday, Claire put on the only decent dress she owned, a simple, cheap black dress, and took 2 buses to the neighborhood where the mansion stood. When she arrived, the gate was open. Expensive cars were parked at the entrance. She walked slowly through the garden she knew all too well. Every tree, every stone, every corner of that place was etched in her memory, not with affection but with pain. The front door was ajar. Claire went in. The foyer was empty, but she could hear voices coming from the library. She followed the sound. When she pushed open the heavy oak door, every eye turned to her. Margaret sat in a red velvet armchair, with Liam to her right and Victoria to her left. Around them were 2 lawyers, an accountant, and 3 witnesses Claire didn't recognize. Ah, Margaret said with a frosty smile, the bastard decided to show up. Claire said nothing. She just sat in a chair in the corner of the room, as far away from everyone as possible. Arnold Harrison, the lead attorney, cleared his throat and opened a leather folder. Let us begin, he announced in a formal, monotone voice. This is the last will and testament of Edward Jonathan Dawson, drafted and signed 6 months before his death. Margaret leaned forward, eyes shining with anticipation. To my wife, Margaret Ann Dawson, Harrison began to read, I leave the principal mansion and all adjacent properties, including furniture, jewelry, and artworks. Margaret smiled. Victoria clapped softly. To my son, Liam Edward Dawson, I leave 40% of the shares of Dawson Enterprises and the post of Executive Vice President. Liam nodded, satisfied. To my daughter, Victoria Louise Dawson, I leave the remaining 30% of shares and the property in Martha's Vineyard. Victoria applauded. I love it, Daddy, she murmured, as if he could still hear her. Claire sat silently, hands in her lap. She knew what was coming next. She knew there would be nothing for her. She knew that the ridiculous hope that had brought her there was just another stab to the chest. But then Harrison turned the page. "And to my daughter, Claire Marie Dawson." The silence was instantaneous. Margaret froze, Liam frowned. Victoria ceased smiling. Claire looked up. Harrison continued. "I leave the key to safe deposit box number 447 at the central bank, a personal letter, and my blessing. May she know that I always loved her, even when I could not show it." There was a moment of silence. Then Margaret burst into laughter. "A key," she said, laughing. "Her safe deposit box key. That's hilarious. While we inherit millions, she inherits a key." Victoria laughed too. "This is almost cruel, isn't it?" Daddy had a sense of humor. Liam, however, did not laugh. He watched Claire with narrowed, suspicious eyes. Harrison stood and handed Claire a small envelope. Inside was an old brass key and a folded scrap of paper. Claire opened it with trembling fingers and read the words her father had written by hand. "Claire, when you understand what justice is, you will know what to do with this. Forgive me for never being brave enough to protect you while I was alive. But in death, perhaps I can do what I could not in life. Trust yourself, always. Your father, Edward." Tears burned Claire's eyes, but she did not let them fall. Not there, not in front of them. "Well," Margaret said, rising and smoothing her skirt. "That was touching. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to. Claire, please do not come back here. You had your crumb. Are you satisfied?" Claire said nothing. She simply tucked the key and the letter into her pocket and left the room without looking back. But as she walked down the mansion's empty corridor, something shifted inside her. That letter was not merely a farewell. It was a clue, a promise, a challenge. Her father had known something, and he wanted her to discover it. That night Claire went to the central bank. She presented the key and was led to a private room. The clerk opened safe 447 and stepped out, leaving her alone. Inside were documents, hundreds of them. Contracts, financial records, printed emails, USB drives with recordings, and a letter. The last letter Edward had written before he died. Claire opened it and read, "Claire, if you are reading this, then I died before finishing what I started. Margaret, Liam, and Victoria have been stealing from the company for 5 years. They forged my signature, diverted funds, corrupted lawyers. I found out too late. This safe contains all the evidence. There is also an unfinished contract. I planned to transfer everything to you, but I didn't have time. Use this evidence, recover what is yours. You are the only Dawson who deserves this name. Your father." Claire read it again, and again, and again. Her hands began to shake, not from fear, from anger, from determination. She gathered all the documents, stuffed them into a bag, and left the bank. Walking down the busy street, Claire swore to herself. They laughed at her, humiliated her, drove her out. But now she had the weapon that would destroy them all, and there would be no mercy. Claire spent the next 3 nights locked in her tiny apartment, reading every document, watching every recording, jotting down every detail. The truth was worse than she had imagined. Margaret was not just a greedy widow, she was a meticulous criminal. 5 years earlier, she had begun diverting money from Dawson Enterprises to offshore accounts. Small amounts at first, then progressively larger sums. Liam aided her, forging signatures, manipulating financial reports. Victoria, though less involved, knew everything and accepted her share of the dirty money. But the worst of all was discovering how Edward had died. Claire found a USB drive labeled "Private, Do Not Open." She plugged it into the laptop and watched a video recording. It was Edward, alone in his office, filming himself. He looked tired, sick, defeated. "My name is Edward Dawson," he began, his voice hoarse. "And I am recording this because I no longer trust anyone. I discovered that my wife Margaret and my children, Liam and Victoria, are poisoning me." Claire froze. "I have been running tests in secret," Edward continued. "The doctors found abnormal levels of arsenic in my blood. Not enough to kill me immediately, but over time. They are killing me slowly." He stopped, breathing with difficulty. His hands trembled. "I was a coward. I did not protect my daughter Claire. I let Margaret treat her like trash. I allowed my children to humiliate her. And now when I finally had the courage to fix things, when I finally decided to transfer everything to Claire, it's too late. They will kill me before I can sign the documents." He looked straight into the camera, and his green eyes, the same green as Claire's, and were full of tears. "Claire, if you are watching this, then I died, and they won. But you have the evidence. You have the truth. Please, do not let them go unpunished. Seek justice, not for me. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but for you." Because you deserve everything they stole. The recording ended. Claire sat in the dark with the laptop still open on the black screen. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply sat there absorbing the truth. Her father had been murdered, and she had the evidence. But Claire knew she couldn't simply go to the police. Margaret had connections, powerful lawyers, judges in her pocket. If Claire presented the evidence now, it would disappear. Witnesses would be bought. Documents would be destroyed. No, she needed a plan. A perfect plan. A plan that would destroy the Dawson family from the inside out, slowly and painfully, the same way they had destroyed her father. Claire opened a new folder on the laptop and began to write. She divided the plan into phases. Phase 1, education. She needed knowledge, power, credibility. No one would take a waitress without formal education seriously. She would enroll at university, law and finance. She would study at night and work by day. She would sacrifice everything. Phase 2, infiltration. She would use the money her father had hidden, a small fund documented in the safe, an account Margaret didn't know existed. With that money, she would begin buying shares of Dawson Enterprises anonymously through shell companies. She would become a shareholder without anyone knowing. Phase 3, destabilization. She would wait. She would watch. And when the right moment arrived, she would strike. She would expose the frauds, force investigations, destroy the family's reputation. Phase 4, seizure of power. Then, when they were at rock bottom, with nowhere left to run, she would reveal who she really was, and she would take everything. Claire saved the file, closed the laptop, and looked out the apartment window. The city glittered in the dark, indifferent to her pain, her rage, her plans. She was 22, young, but youth was not a weakness. It was time to learn, time to grow, time to become the person they would never expect. That night Claire made a promise to herself and to the ghost of the father who had never protected her. She would destroy the Dawson family, not with rage, not with violence, but with the only things they truly loved, money, power, and status. She would take those things from them, and they would watch, helpless, as it all crumbled. In the days that followed, Claire enrolled at the state university. She secured a partial scholarship and used the money from the safe to pay the rest. She worked from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the cafe, studied from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. at the university, and spent the nights reading about corporate finance, business law, and hostile acquisition strategies. She changed, not just intellectually, but physically. She cut her hair. She altered her posture. She learned to dress with confidence, to speak with authority, to meet people's eyes without fear. She ceased to be Claire, the invisible bastard, and she began to become Claire Dawson, the unknown heiress. 3 years passed. Claire graduated with honors. She secured an internship at an investment firm. She learned the secrets of the financial market. She made contacts. She created shell companies. She bought shares. And meanwhile, Dawson Enterprises began to crumble. Margaret did not notice. Liam was too busy spending money on cars and parties. Victoria lived in a world of illusions, traveling from Paris to Milan, posting staged photos of happiness on social media. They did not see what was happening. They did not see that someone was buying their shares. They did not see the company being corroded from within. But Claire saw everything. And when the right moment arrived, she was ready. While they laughed at the past, she was buying their future. 5 years after the reading of the will, Claire Dawson was unrecognizable. She was seated in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, dressed in a charcoal gray Armani suit, her hair tied back in a flawless bun, her makeup subtle but strategic. In front of her, 3 nervous Dawson Enterprises executives flipped through contracts with trembling hands. "Miss Dawson," said one of them, a middle-aged man with round glasses, "CD Holdings is offering $340 million for 51% of Dawson Enterprises shares. It's a generous offer, but I have to ask, what's your real interest in the company?" Claire smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile, one she had practiced hundreds of times in front of a mirror. "Investment," she replied, her tone firm and professional. "Dawson Enterprises has potential, but it's being mismanaged. I intend to fix that." The executives exchanged uneasy looks. "And what about the Dawson family?" asked another. "Margaret Dawson is still the indirect majority shareholder. She won't allow a hostile takeover." "Leave Margaret Dawson to me," Claire said, leaning forward slightly. "All you need to do is make sure the paperwork is filed legally. The rest is my problem." She didn't reveal her identity. CD Holdings was an investment firm registered in the Cayman Islands, shielded by 5 layers of intermediary companies protecting its true owner. It would take months, perhaps years, for anyone to discover that CD stood for Claire Dawson, and by then it would be far too late. In the 5 years since opening the safe, Claire had turned $2 million into $400 million. She had invested wisely, taking advantage of every weakness Margaret and Liam created in the company. Every minor scandal, every stock dip, every strategic blunder, Claire was there, quietly buying at low prices, silently amassing power. Meanwhile, the Dawson family was drowning in luxury and incompetence. Margaret spent fortunes on extravagant parties, desperate to maintain the image of a powerful, respectable widow. But behind the facade, she was panicking. Tax investigations were closing in. Auditors were asking questions. Minor shareholders were starting to demand answers. Liam had tried to take control of the company, but was a disaster. He made impulsive decisions, invested in ridiculous projects, alienated major clients with his arrogance. In just 2 years, Dawson Enterprises had lost 35% of its market value. Victoria simply didn't care. She sold off her shares bit by bit to fund her unsustainable lifestyle. Yachts, mansions on 3 continents, priceless jewelry she wore once and discarded. And Claire watched it all from a distance, noting every mistake, every scandal, every moment of weakness. She had changed completely. Her light brown hair was now platinum blonde, cut straight at shoulder length. She wore blue contact lenses to hide the green eyes that would betray her. She had lost weight, toned her body through rigorous training. She had learned to walk differently, to speak differently, to exist differently. No one who had once known her as the timid, invisible bastard would recognize her now. Claire had also built an entire life as C.D. Mercer, a false name, but with real documents. She had a passport, bank accounts, a credit history. She existed on paper, and that gave her freedom. Freedom to destroy. One night, Claire was in her apartment, no longer the miserable cubicle from 5 years ago, but a modern, minimalist loft overlooking the Hudson River. She opened a bottle of red wine, poured herself a glass, and called her lawyer. "Arnold," she said when he answered. It wasn't Arnold Harrison, the man who had read her father's will. That one was long retired. This was Arnold Westfield, a ruthless corporate attorney Claire had hired to execute her plans. "Miss Mercer," he replied, "good news. We secured another 12% of Dawson Enterprises shares through intermediaries. You now control, indirectly, 48% of the company." Claire smiled. "Excellent. And the audit? It's scheduled for next quarter. Once the auditors start digging, they'll find everything. The embezzlements, the offshore accounts, the forged signatures. Margaret and Liam won't have anywhere to hide." "Perfect," Claire said, taking a sip of wine. "Prepare the paperwork for the public offer. I want my identity hidden until the very last possible moment." "Understood." Claire hung up and walked to the window. The city glittered below her, millions of lights blinking in the dark. She thought of the Dawson mansion, empty and cold, with Margaret sitting alone on her throne of lies. Soon, that throne would collapse, and Claire would be there to watch it happen. Claire spent her days analyzing financial reports, tracking suspicious bank movements, building a dossier that would leave no room for doubt. At night, she studied the psychological profiles of Margaret, Liam, and Victoria. She knew their weaknesses, their fears, their vanities. Margaret feared losing social status more than anything. Her entire identity was tied to the Dawson name, to the false respect people showed her. Without that, she was nothing. Liam feared being exposed as incompetent. He masked his insecurity behind arrogance and toxic bravado. But deep down, he knew he'd never be half the man Edward had been. Victoria feared aging, being forgotten, losing the beauty she used as armor. Every wrinkle, every unflattering photo, every cruel comment online tore her apart inside. Claire knew all these fears, and she would use them. But she wasn't in a hurry. Rushed revenge was wasted revenge. Claire had learned that true power lay in patience, in letting your enemies destroy themselves while you simply watched and waited for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment was coming. While they laughed at the past, she was buying their future. The first crack in the Dawson family's facade appeared on a rainy Tuesday in November. Margaret was having breakfast in the main dining room when her phone rang. It was Gerald Hutchins, Dawson Enterprises' chief accountant. His voice was trembling. "Mrs. Dawson, we need to talk, urgently." "Gerald, I'm busy. It's about the company's shares. Someone is buying them, a lot of them, And we don't know who it is. Margaret froze, the porcelain cup suspended in mid-air. What do you mean you don't know who it is? They're shell companies, registered in offshore havens. We've traced 5 layers of intermediaries, but we can't get to the real buyer. Whoever it is, they're doing this extremely professionally and deliberately. Margaret set the cup down so hard that it cracked. How much? 48%, ma'am. Someone controls almost half of the company. The blood drained from Margaret's face. 48%. That meant she had lost the majority. It meant someone could force a shareholder vote. It meant she was vulnerable. Who? She whispered. We don't know. But there's an extraordinary shareholders meeting scheduled for next month, and whoever it is will show up. Margaret hung up and sat in silence for several minutes. Then she called Liam. He arrived an hour later, still wearing last night's clothes, reeking of whiskey and cheap perfume. What is it, Mother? He muttered, collapsing into a chair. Someone is trying to take our company, Margaret said, her voice cold and controlled. And you're going to find out who it is. Liam blinked, processing the words. What do you mean, take the company? Someone bought 48% of the shares, anonymously. And in 1 month there will be a shareholders meeting where that person can vote to remove us from the board. Liam sat up straight, finally realizing the gravity of the situation. That's not possible. Who would have that kind of money? Find out, Margaret interrupted. Hire investigators, lawyers, hackers, if necessary. I will not lose what Edward built to some corporate vulture. Liam nodded and left quickly. Margaret remained alone in the hall, staring at the portraits of the Dawsons on the walls, generations of powerful men and women, all looking down with stern, judging expressions. She couldn't fail. She couldn't lose. Not after everything she had done. Meanwhile, across town, Claire was in a meeting with Arnold Westfield. They know someone's been buying, Arnold said. Margaret has hired 3 different investigative firms. They're trying to trace CD holdings. Claire didn't look concerned. How long until they find out? With the layers we built? Months at least. And by then the meeting will already have happened. Good. What about the audit? Arnold smiled, a predatory smile. The auditors found irregularities, major ones. They're preparing a report that will be delivered to the board and simultaneously to the district attorney's office. Claire closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It was happening. Really happening. When? 2 weeks before the meeting. Enough time to cause panic, but not enough for them to destroy the evidence. Perfect. Claire stood and walked to the window of the office. Below, people hurried through the streets, each carrying their own problems, fears, and secrets. She wondered how many of them carried the same rage she did. How many like her were waiting for the right moment to destroy those who had hurt them. Arnold, she said without turning around, I want you to prepare something for me. A document. Actually, a video. What kind of video? A message. To be played at the shareholders' meeting, right before I reveal who I am. Arnold grabbed a notepad. What do you want it to say? Claire turned, and her eyes, now back to their natural green without the blue lenses, gleamed with cold determination. I want them to see what they did to me. I want them to see who I was and who I became. I want them to understand exactly why they're losing everything. Arnold wrote quickly. It'll be done. In the following weeks, Dawson Enterprises began to collapse, slowly but inevitably. First, the audit report leaked to the press. Newspapers splashed shocking headlines across the front pages. Dawson family accused of billion-dollar fraud. Embezzlement scandal, family empire on the brink of ruin. Margaret Dawson under criminal investigation. The company's stock plummeted 40% in a week. Clients cancelled contracts. Suppliers demanded advance payments. Employees began to resign. Margaret tried to control the damage, giving tearful interviews and denying everything. But the evidence was too solid. The documents, too detailed. The recordings, too clear. Liam hired high-priced lawyers who promised to fix everything, but even they knew it was a lost cause. For the first time in her life, Victoria stopped posting on social media. Her accounts were flooded with hateful comments, people calling her a thief, a parasite, a criminal. She locked herself inside her Paris penthouse and refused to come out. And then came the day of the shareholders' meeting. Claire woke up early that morning. She put on a black Dior suit and red Louboutin heels, not out of vanity but as a symbol. Red meant blood, justice, revenge. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for the first time in 5 years set the contact lenses aside. Her green eyes, Edward Dawson's eyes, shone back at her. She was ready. Arnold picked her up in a black limousine. On the way to the Dawson Enterprises building, he handed her a folder with all the necessary documents. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Once you walk into that room, there's no going back." Claire looked out the window, watching the city flash by. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. When they arrived, journalists were everywhere. Cameras, microphones, flashing lights. The extraordinary shareholders' meeting of Dawson Enterprises was the most anticipated corporate event of the year. Claire stepped out of the limousine, and the reporters swarmed her. "Who are you? Are you the representative of CD Holdings? Is it true you're taking over the company?" Claire didn't answer a single question. She just walked silently, Arnold beside her, toward the building's entrance. In the elevator, as they rose to the 18th floor where the meeting would take place, Arnold asked, "Any last words before we go in?" Claire smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had waited years for this moment. "Just one," she said. "They thought they destroyed me that rainy night, but in truth they created the person who's going to destroy them." The elevator doors opened, and the heiress walked in to claim her throne. The boardroom was packed. Shareholders, lawyers, executives, journalists, all crammed into black leather chairs, whispering anxiously among themselves. In the center stood a long mahogany table where Margaret, Liam, and 3 board members sat, tense and pale. Margaret wore a blood-red suit and pearls, trying to maintain the appearance of power, but her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. Liam sat beside her, jaw clenched, glancing at the door every 5 seconds. Victoria wasn't there. She had sent a lawyer to represent her, a thin man with thick glasses nervously flipping through papers. At the front of the room, a huge screen was set up. A projector waited silently. The chairman of the meeting, a grey-haired attorney named Theodore Marks, struck the gavel against the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. This is an extraordinary shareholders' meeting of Dawson Enterprises. Today we will discuss the restructuring of the board and the potential change in company control." He cleared his throat. "CD Holdings, which now owns 48% of the shares, has requested a vote to remove the current board members and assume operational control of the company. Before we proceed, the representative of CD Holdings would like to make a statement." Absolute silence. All eyes turned to the door, and then it opened. Claire walked in. Her steps were steady and deliberate, her red heels echoing against the marble floor. Her black suit was immaculate. Her blonde hair fell loose in soft waves over her shoulders. But it was her eyes, those bright green eyes, that captured everyone's attention. Margaret frowned. There was something familiar about those eyes. Liam leaned forward, studying the woman walking toward the head of the table. Claire stopped in the center of the room, turned to face the audience, and smiled. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Claire Dawson, and I am the owner of CD Holdings." Silence erupted into chaos. Journalists shouted questions. Shareholders whispered in disbelief. Lawyers frantically flipped through documents, and at the head of the table Margaret went white as a sheet. "No," she whispered. "No, it's not possible." Liam jumped to his feet, knocking over his chair. "This is a fraud. This woman isn't—" "Sit down, Liam," Claire cut in, her voice cold as ice. She looked directly at him, and for the first time he truly saw who she was. Edward's green eyes, his jawline, the way she tilted her head when she spoke. It was her, the bastard, the girl they had thrown out into the rain, but different, transformed, powerful. "You," Liam began, but the words died in his throat. Claire walked up to the table where Margaret sat and placed a leather folder in front of her. "Read it," Claire ordered. Margaret didn't move. Her hands were frozen in her lap. Claire opened the folder herself and began to read aloud. "Independent Audit Report, Dawson Enterprises. Findings: systematic embezzlement of funds totaling $127 million over 5 years. Forged signatures on corporate contracts. Creation of illegal offshore accounts. Federal-level tax evasion." She turned the page. "And the most interesting part, evidence of homicide. Edward Dawson, former CEO, was slowly poisoned with arsenic by members of his own family." Gasps filled the room. Cameras flashed. Journalists rushed to their phones. Margaret tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Liam grabbed her arm to steady her. "This is a lie," he shouted. "All lies." Claire turned toward the massive screen. Arnold, seated discreetly at the back, activated the projector. The screen flickered to life, and Edward Dawson's face appeared. It was the recording, the confession he had made before he died. Margaret let out a strangled sound. Edward's voice filled the room, weak but clear. My name is Edward Dawson, and I'm recording this because I no longer trust anyone. I discovered that my wife, Margaret, and my children, Liam and Victoria, are poisoning me. The room erupted into total chaos. Margaret collapsed into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Liam tried to shut off the projector, but security guards stopped him. The video kept playing, and relentless, merciless, revealing every sordid detail of the family's betrayal. When it ended, the silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that comes before a death sentence. Claire waited. Let the weight of the moment crush everyone in the room. Then she spoke again, her voice low but lethal. You threw me out of the Dawson mansion when I was 22. Margaret called me a bastard in front of the entire city's elite. Liam dragged me through the rain like trash. Victoria laughed. You all laughed. She walked slowly around the table, like a predator circling its prey. But you made a mistake. You underestimated me. You thought I'd disappear, that I'd starve in some filthy alley, that I'd never become anything. She stopped in front of Margaret and crouched down to meet her eyes. But I didn't die. I studied. I worked. I invested. And while you were destroying the company my father built, I was buying every single piece you dropped. Margaret looked up at Claire, tears in her eyes, not of remorse, but of fear. Claire, please, she began. No, Claire cut her off. You don't have the right to say my name, not after what you did. She stood and turned to the assembly. I have here legal documents proving that my father, Edward Dawson, intended to transfer all his assets to me before his death. He discovered the fraud. He discovered he was being poisoned, and he tried to protect me. She held the papers up high. This is the true last will and testament of Edward Dawson. Authenticated, filed, legal. Theodore Marks, the presiding attorney, took the documents with trembling hands and began to read. His eyes widened. This is valid, he said, his voice faint. This document supersedes the previous will. Claire Dawson is the rightful heir to the entire Dawson fortune. Margaret let out a shrill scream. Liam slammed his fist onto the table, cracking the wood, but Claire felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. Justice wasn't sweet. It was necessary. I call for a vote, Claire said formally. All in favor of removing Margaret Dawson, Liam Dawson, and Victoria Dawson from the board, and appointing Claire Dawson as CEO of Dawson Enterprises. Hands went up, one by one. Executives, shareholders, even a few who had once been loyal to Margaret. The vote was unanimous. Theodore struck the gavel. The motion is approved. Claire Dawson is now the CEO and majority shareholder of Dawson Enterprises. Margaret collapsed. Liam shouted obscenities. Security entered the room to escort them out, and Claire stood alone at the center of the room, watching them being dragged away, the same way she had been dragged out years ago. But she felt no joy, only the weight of years of pain, loneliness, and anger finally reaching their end. They had thrown her out like trash. Now they were the ones being dragged away, and the heiress had finally claimed her throne. 3 days after the shareholders' meeting, Claire called a public press conference. The event took place in the same Dawson Enterprises building, but this time, Claire sat in the CEO's chair, a black leather seat that had once belonged to her father. Dozens of journalists filled the room, cameras aimed, recorders on. Claire wore a spotless white suit, a symbolic choice. White for justice, white for truth, white for rebirth. Arnold Westfield sat beside her, along with 2 criminal lawyers and the company's new chief financial officer. Claire adjusted the microphone and began, Good afternoon. My name is Claire Marie Dawson. I am the youngest daughter of Edward Dawson and the new CEO of Dawson Enterprises. I've called this press conference to clarify the facts about what happened over the past 5 years and to speak about the future of this company. She took a deep breath. My father was murdered. The silence was deafening. He was systematically poisoned over several months by members of his own family, specifically my stepmother, Margaret Dawson, and my half-brother, Liam Dawson. They did it to gain full control of the company and the family's fortune. Camera flashes exploded. Journalists shouted questions. Claire raised her hand, signaling for silence. I have proof, recordings, medical documents, witnesses. Everything has been delivered to the district attorney's office, and a criminal case has already been opened. A journalist raised his hand. Miss Dawson, why did you wait so long to reveal this? Claire looked directly into the camera. Because I needed to be certain justice would be served. If I had spoken out immediately, Margaret would have used her connections to destroy the evidence. So I waited. I studied. I built my own power. And when I finally revealed the truth, she had nowhere left to run. Another journalist asked, "Are you doing this out of revenge?" Claire hesitated. It was the same question she asked herself every night. "No," she answered slowly. "I'm doing this for justice. There's a difference. Revenge is emotional, impulsive, destructive. Justice is calculated, necessary, restorative. My father deserves justice. The employees of this company who were robbed deserve justice. I deserve justice." The conference continued for another hour. Claire answered every question with clarity, composure, and precision. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't show excessive emotion. She was professional, controlled, unshakable. When it ended, she stood and left the room beneath a storm of flashes and shouted questions. Later that night, Claire visited the prison where Margaret and Liam were being held while awaiting trial. She didn't have to go. She owed them nothing. But there was something she needed to say, something she needed to see with her own eyes. Margaret was brought in first. She looked 10 years older. Her platinum hair was messy, unkempt. She wore no makeup. The pearls and silk dresses were gone, replaced by an orange prison uniform. But it was her eyes that had changed most. They were empty, defeated, broken. She sat down on the other side of the glass and picked up the phone with trembling hands. Claire picked up hers. For a long moment they just stared at each other. Then Margaret spoke, her voice hoarse. "You won." Claire said nothing. "You destroyed everything," Margaret continued, tears running down her face. "My reputation, my family, my life." "No," Claire replied calmly. "You destroyed yourself. I just made the consequences visible." Margaret sobbed. "I hated you," she confessed, "from the moment Edward brought you into the house. You were the living proof of his betrayal. Every time I looked at you, I saw the woman he cheated on me with. And that's why you tortured me," Claire said, emotionless. "A child, innocent. You tortured me because you didn't have the courage to confront your husband." Margaret closed her eyes. "I know. You made me sleep in the servants' quarters, made me wear old clothes, humiliated me in front of strangers, threw me out into the rain like garbage. I know. And then you killed my father." Margaret opened her eyes, filled with despair. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop planning to leave me. He was going to transfer everything to you, everything. After all I did for him, all the years I spent by his side, he was going to leave me with nothing." Claire leaned forward. "And you think that justifies murder?" Margaret didn't answer. Claire stood up. "You're going to spend the rest of your life here, Margaret. No luxury, no power, no respect. You'll die in a cell, forgotten and alone, and when you die, no one will cry." She hung up the phone and started walking toward the door. "Claire!" Margaret screamed, pounding on the glass. "Claire, please, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." But Claire didn't look back. Liam was next. He entered the visitation room with a bruised, swollen face. Apparently, he had picked a fight with other inmates and lost. He could barely open his left eye. He grabbed the phone in anger. "Came to gloat?" he spat. Claire looked at him coolly. "No, I came to tell you that Victoria is cooperating with the authorities." Liam's face drained of all color. "What?" "She made a deal. She's going to testify against you and Margaret in exchange for partial immunity. Apparently, she doesn't want to spend 20 years in prison." Liam slammed his fist against the glass. "That bitch, that—" "Careful," Claire interrupted. "You're still being recorded." Liam breathed heavily, trying to calm himself. "You'll pay for this," he threatened. "When I get out of here—" "You're not getting out," Claire said evenly. "You'll be convicted of murder, corporate fraud, and document forgery. You'll spend at least 30 years in prison. And when you finally get out, you'll be an old, broken, forgotten man." She stood up. "Goodbye, Liam. I hope you have time to think about what you've done, about who you could have been, if you'd chosen to be decent." Liam shouted obscenities as Claire walked away. But his words no longer reached her. She was far beyond that now. The following week, the trial began. The media covered every second. Witnesses paraded through the courtroom, telling stories of corruption, manipulation, and cruelty. The lawyer who had read the false will confessed he'd been bribed by Margaret. Former maids described how Claire had been treated in the mansion. Doctors presented evidence of poisoning. And Claire, sitting in the front row, watched it all in silence. When it was her turn to testify, she took the stand calmly. The prosecutor asked gentle questions, giving her space to tell her story. And Claire told it. Without dramatics, without self-pity, just facts. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except hers. The jury took only 3 hours to deliberate. Guilty, on all charges. Margaret was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Liam, to 30. Victoria, who testified against them, received 5 years of probation and was banned from holding any corporate position. When the verdict was read, Margaret collapsed. Liam sat in silence, eyes empty, and Claire walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Justice had been served, but there was no celebration, only the echo of years of pain closing at last in a cruel, necessary circle. The masks had fallen, and beneath them there were only monsters dressed as humans. 6 months after the trial, Claire called for the official reading of Edward Dawson's true will. The ceremony took place in the mansion, the same mansion from which she had been thrown out years before. But now the mansion was hers, legally, morally, completely. Claire decided the reading would be public. Journalists, former Dawson Enterprises employees, members of the community who had known Edward, everyone was invited. She wanted the world to know the truth, all of it. The library was prepared for the occasion. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. A notary was present, lawyers, witnesses, and in the center of the room, on the large oak desk where Edward used to work, lay the original will, the document Margaret and Liam had tried to destroy, but which Edward had hidden in the safe along with all the other evidence. Claire entered the library wearing a simple, elegant black dress. No jewelry, no heavy makeup. She no longer needed armor. The truth was protection enough. She sat in the main chair and nodded for the notary to begin. Theodore Marks, the same lawyer who had presided over the shareholders' meeting months earlier, opened the sealed envelope and began to read, "I, Edward Jonathan Dawson, being of sound mind and frail body, declare this to be my last will and testament." The room fell into absolute silence. I acknowledge that I made many mistakes in my life. I was a coward when I should have been brave. I was silent when I should have spoken. I allowed the fear of public opinion to stop me from protecting those I loved. Theodore paused, clearing his throat. But my greatest mistake was failing to protect my daughter, Claire Marie Dawson. She was born out of true love, not out of betrayal as my wife always claimed, but from a relationship I had years before marrying Margaret. Her mother died giving birth, and I, the coward that I was, hid Claire inside my own home as if she were a disgrace. Tears began to sting Claire's eyes, but she held them back. Claire grew up without love, without protection, without a real father, and I failed her. Every day I saw the pain in her eyes and did nothing, because I was weak. Theodore's voice trembled now. Even he was moved. But now in death I will try to correct what I lacked the courage to correct in life. By this will, I declare that my entire fortune, all my properties, all my shares, and all my material assets belong solely and exclusively to my daughter, Claire Marie Dawson. Murmurs spread through the room. Margaret will receive only what the law requires, a minimal amount to ensure she is not destitute, but nothing more. Liam and Victoria will receive nothing. They have never worked for anything. They have never loved anything but money, and I will not reward that greed. Theodore turned the page. Claire is the only one worthy of the Dawson name. She is the only one who suffered, fought, and survived without ever asking me for anything. She is strong where I was weak, brave where I was cowardly, and I only hope that one day she can forgive me. He closed the document. Signed, Edward Jonathan Dawson, witnessed by 3 independent attorneys and a public notary, filed and authenticated 6 months before his death. Silence. And then applause. At first soft, hesitant, then stronger, until the entire room was on its feet, clapping. Claire remained seated, staring at the will on the table. The tears finally fell. Not from sadness, but from something far more complex. Relief, pain, justice, loss. Her father had loved her, in a twisted, cowardly, imperfect way, but he had loved her. And now, at last, the world knew. After the ceremony, Claire asked everyone to leave. She needed a moment alone. When the library was empty, she walked to the window, the same one she used to stare through as a child, imagining what it would be like to be free. Now she was free, powerful, wealthy, respected. But inside, there was an emptiness no victory could fill. Her father was dead, her childhood stolen, her innocence destroyed. She had won, but the price had been steep. Claire opened one of Edward's desk drawers and found an old photograph, of her and her father, taken when she was only 5. It was the only photo they had ever taken together. Edward held her in his arms and both were smiling. She didn't remember that moment, but she saw it now, preserved forever in that faded image. Claire pressed the photo against her chest and for the first time in years allowed herself to truly cry, not for what she had lost, but for what she never had: a family, a home, unconditional love. After a long while she composed herself, carefully placed the photo in her bag, took a deep breath. There was work to be done, a company to rebuild, employees to protect, a legacy to restore. Edward Dawson had been a flawed man, but he had built something real, and now it was up to Claire to honor that, not for the father he had been, but for the person she had chosen to become. She left the library, closed the door behind her, and walked through the mansion's empty halls. Every room echoed with painful memories, but now she had the power to create new ones, better ones, kinder ones. Maybe one day that house would stop being a mausoleum of pain and become something else, but for now Claire had justice, and that would have to be enough. The name restored, the legacy reclaimed, the heiress finally recognized, but the emptiness remained. 2 months after the reading of the will, Claire was in the main office of Dawson Enterprises, signing documents that would mark the definitive end of the Margaret era. The Dawson mansion would be sold. Not out of financial necessity. Claire was a billionaire now, but out of emotional necessity. That house carried too many ghosts, too much pain. She couldn't turn it into a home, so she would turn it into symbolic ashes. She hired a luxury auction company to sell everything: furniture, artwork, jewelry, Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers. Every item that once represented the Dawson family's power would now be scattered among strangers. On the day of the auction, Claire was there. She watched as wealthy buyers walked through the mansion, touching things that were once untouchable, appraising objects that had once been symbols of status. A middle-aged woman bought Margaret's portrait for $3,000. "For ironic decoration," she said, laughing. Claire didn't react. A collector bought the dining table where Claire had been humiliated that rainy night. He planned to display it in a museum about powerful families fallen from grace. The chandeliers were sold. The velvet curtains, the sculptures, everything. When the house was empty, Claire walked through the bare rooms one last time. The echo of her footsteps was deafening. Without furniture, without life, the mansion seemed even bigger and even colder. She stopped in the small room where she had slept as a child, a tiny cubicle beside the laundry. No window, just a narrow bed and a broken wardrobe. Claire remembered how many nights she had spent there, listening to the laughter coming from the main hall, wishing to be included, wishing to be loved. Now she felt nothing, only the quiet stillness of a cycle finally closed. She went down the stairs one last time and stepped out the front door. Outside, a moving truck was taking away the last of the pieces. She watched as they loaded the grand piano Victoria used to play, poorly but arrogantly. Arnold Westfield was waiting by the car. "It's done," he said. "The mansion was sold to a real estate developer. They're going to demolish it and build a luxury condominium." Claire nodded. It seemed fitting. The Dawson mansion would be erased from existence, replaced by something new, something without history, without ghosts. "And what about Margaret and Liam?" Claire asked. "Margaret's in federal prison. Solitary confinement, from what I've heard. No visitors. Liam's in a maximum security facility. He's gotten into several fights and now spends most of his time in isolation. And Victoria? She moved to the countryside, lives in a small town, works at a clothing store, uses a fake name. No one knows who she really is." Claire thought about that for a moment. Victoria had lost everything: beauty, status, money, and now lived as an ordinary person. Perhaps that was the cruelest punishment of all, not prison, but mediocrity. "Leave her alone," Claire said. "She's not a threat." Arnold nodded. They got into the car and drove away. Claire looked in the rearview mirror as the mansion disappeared in the distance. She didn't feel sadness. She didn't feel relief. Only nothing. The chapter was closed. In the following months, Claire focused entirely on Dawson Enterprises. She fired corrupt executives, hired new talent, implemented ethical policies, and opened internal investigations. The company began to recover, slowly but steadily. Clients returned. Investors regained confidence. Employees once again felt proud to work there. Claire also created the Edward Dawson Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping young people from broken families. She donated $50 million as initial capital. "My father failed me," she said in an interview, "but maybe I can make sure other children don't suffer the same." The foundation provided scholarships, free therapy, professional mentorship, and legal support for youth in situations of family abuse. It was Claire's way of turning her pain into something useful, something that mattered. And as the empire that had almost destroyed her now thrived under her leadership, Claire discovered something surprising. She felt no pleasure in victory, no joy in power, only responsibility. Money didn't make her happy. Status didn't fill the void. Complete revenge hadn't brought peace. She had destroyed her enemies, reclaimed her legacy, proven her worth, but she still felt alone. One night, Claire was in her apartment staring out at the illuminated city when her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered. "Claire Dawson," said a hesitant female voice. "Yes, my name is Elena. I used to work as a maid at the Dawson mansion many years ago. I took care of you when you were little." Claire froze. "Elena," she repeated, searching her memory. And then she remembered a kind middle-aged woman who secretly gave her extra food and warm blankets during the winter. "I saw the news," Elena continued. "I saw what you went through, what you achieved. And I just wanted to call and say, I'm sorry I didn't do more for you back then. I was a coward. I was afraid of losing my job." Tears burned in Claire's eyes. "Eleanor, you don't have to apologize. You were kind to me when no one else was. I never forgot that." There was silence on the other end. Then Elena spoke again, her voice trembling. "You deserved so much more, Claire. You were such a sweet child." They talked for another hour. About the past, the present, about how strange and unpredictable life could be. When they hung up, Claire realized something. Justice doesn't heal everything. Money doesn't heal everything. Power doesn't heal everything. But kindness, even small, even late, still matters. The fall of the Dawsons was complete. But Claire's rise had only just begun. And this time, she wouldn't rise alone. 3 years later, Claire stood in front of the land where the Dawson mansion once stood. Now there was only a modern condominium of glass and steel. Families lived there. Children played in the playground, ordinary people living ordinary lives. The mansion had been erased, as if it had never existed. Claire held a bouquet of white lilies, her father's favorite flowers. She placed them on the ground, roughly where his office used to be. "Hi, Dad," she whispered. "I wanted to tell you that. I did it. I did what you asked me to. I took everything back, exposed the truth, brought justice." The wind blew softly, making her hair sway. "But it wasn't how I imagined," she continued. "I thought I'd feel complete, fulfilled, but there's still an emptiness. Because in the end, what I really wanted wasn't the company or the money or the mansion. It was you. It was to be loved, to have a real family." She closed her eyes. "But you're gone, and I can't change that." Claire took a deep breath and stood up. "So instead I'll create something new. I'll use what you left behind to build something better, something that would have made you proud, if you'd been brave enough to be the father I needed." She touched the ground lightly. A final goodbye. "Rest in peace, Dad. Your daughter is okay, finally." Claire walked back to the car where Arnold was waiting for her. "Where to now?" he asked. "To the office. We have a meeting with the foundation at 3. As the car drove away, Claire looked one last time in the rearview mirror. The past was buried, literally and figuratively, and for the first time in her life, Claire allowed herself to look forward, without anger, without pain, without the thirst for revenge. She was no longer the bastard thrown out into the rain. She was no longer the vengeful heiress. She was simply Claire, and that was enough. That night in her apartment, Claire took out the old photograph, the only picture of her with her father, and placed it in a simple frame on her desk, not as an altar of pain, but as a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, we can choose who we become. They had taught her to hate, but her father, even in his weakness, had taught her how to win. And Claire chose to win with dignity, because in the end, the best revenge isn't the destruction of your enemies. It's the creation of a life so full that the past loses its power to define you. Claire closed the door to the past and opened the window to the future.